My name is Clara. I am 36 years old, and on the night of my brother's wedding, I walked into the ballroom already bracing myself for the whispers. For as long as I can remember, my family has labeled me the failure, the one who would never marry, never matter. And under the chandeliers and in front of hundreds of guests, my brother's words cut through me, turning me into the evening's cruel entertainment. What no one at that glittering table knew was that I carried a truth powerful enough to turn their laughter into silence. Have you ever wondered what happens when the one they call a failure finally rises? Stay with me because this night would leave them speechless. White roses lined the aisles, their scent thick and sweet, mingling with the sharper notes of champagne from crystal flutes. Laughter floated around me, small talk, and the clinking of cutlery against porcelain, and everyone looked as if this was not just a wedding but a coronation. Women in glittering gowns, diamonds catching the light. Men in tailored tuxedos, shoes polished to mirror the chandeliers above. I had chosen differently. My dress was simple and black, cut in a way that needed no excess. Around my neck, I wore the one heirloom left to me, my grandmother's string of pearls cool against my skin. Each step I took echoed faintly on the marble. Eyes turned toward me and lingered. Some slid over me like knives, measuring and comparing me to the spectacle of the evening. I reached the family table, the place reserved for appearances, if not for truth. There was my younger brother Daniel at the center, his tuxedo sitting on him like armor, his hair slicked back so not a single strand dared to move. Relatives and my father's colleagues clustered around him, their voices a little too loud, their compliments expertly timed. When he saw me, his gaze moved in a single practiced sweep from the pearls at my throat to the modest heels on my feet. I knew that look. I had seen it many times growing up. His mouth curved into that same half-smile, sharp as a blade, meant for the audience more than for me. The table fell quiet. The clatter of forks and the murmur of conversation seemed to still, as though the room leaned in to hear what he would say next. With his voice pitched just loud enough to carry, Daniel spoke. "Old and still poor. Who would ever marry you?" The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples through the table. Silence stretched and then splintered into laughter. Aunt Lydia pressed her napkin to her mouth to hide a grin. Uncle Frank shook his head with a chuckle and looked at me with that feigned pity. Others smiled. A few glanced away uneasily, and no one stood up for me. My cheeks flushed so hot, I felt certain the color could be seen even under the ballroom lights. I stood there, rooted chest tight, pulsing a furious drum. Daniel's sneer, the relatives' laughter, the hush that served as confirmation of what they all believed I was, the family disappointment. In that glittering room, I had become the joke. For a beat, I wanted to snap. I imagined a truth so sharp it would silence him, the revelation that would make their smiles slide off their faces. I pictured standing up and telling them everything they did not know and would not imagine. But I stopped myself. If I spoke now, they would see only bitterness. They would laugh harder and later whisper that Clara had finally cracked. They would say I could not take a joke. So I did nothing. I lifted my chin and walked to my seat. My heels tapped softly, but inside each step felt like a promise. The laughter rose behind me, but I did not turn. My silence became armor. Inside me, anger smoldered, coiling tighter with every breath I took. I sat, smoothed my napkin across my lap, kept my back straight and my face composed. Outwardly, I was calm. Inside, I burned. Daniel believed he had made me a fool at his wedding. He had no idea he had lit a fire I had carried for years, a slow, patient flame waiting for the right moment to prove the truth. He raised his glass, his smile back on as if nothing had happened. Conversation resumed around him, light and airy. For everyone else, the night was unchanged. For me, the night had already shifted. The insult had opened a wound and sharpened my resolve. I would not always be the one to sit silent and swallow humiliation. One day soon the balance would tip. He would see me differently. They all would. Those who laughed tonight would be the ones averting their eyes when the truth finally crashed down on them. I touched the cool pearls at my throat and felt my grandmother's steady voice in my memory telling me to hold my head high no matter how others tried to bow it. I took a breath, let it out slowly, and folded my hands. Around me, the wedding glittered and sang, but already I was somewhere else in a quiet place of planning and patience. They laughed tonight. That much was true. Laughter fades. Truth does not. I would not need to shout to win. I would stand in my truth. When that day came, their laughter would curdle into shame. I pressed my lips together and stared straight ahead, ignoring the chatter. Let them enjoy their illusions while they can. Tonight they believed me powerless, but the night would end, and when morning came, it would be my turn. The laughter from the ballroom still echoed in my head, but it was no longer the chandeliers above me or the murmur of guests around me that I saw. In a heartbeat, I was back in Connecticut, walking up the cracked stone steps of our old white wooden house, the one tucked under a canopy of maple trees that blazed red and gold each autumn. That house held the shape of my childhood, but when I closed my eyes, all I could feel was the weight of being invisible inside it. Every evening was orchestrated like a performance. My father Robert always sat at the head of the table, a heavy glass of whiskey in hand, his gaze sharp even when silent. My mother Susan would move with precision, aligning the napkins perfectly, adjusting the silverware until it gleamed. And Daniel, younger by 3 years, but taller, louder, more favored, was always the star. His stories, his grades, his charm, those were the centerpieces of our meals. I was there too, but only as a shadow. I still remember the night I gathered enough courage to speak. The plates had just been set down, steam rising from roasted chicken and mashed potatoes. I took a breath, my heart hammering in my chest, and said I wanted to study nutrition, to dedicate myself to community health, to help families who didn't have access to proper food. For a moment there was silence, the kind that feels like a drop into icy water. My father's brow furrowed as he stared into his glass, swirling the amber liquid. Then I saw it, that fleeting exchange of looks between my parents. My mother's lips pressed into a thin line before she gave a small laugh that wasn't laughter at all. "Clara, you need a real career. No one admires cooking or caring for the poor." Her voice was crisp, almost gentle, but it landed like a blade. The dining room went cold. The sound of the clock ticking on the wall grew louder, filling the silence. My father cleared his throat, tapping his finger against the rim of his glass, and shifted the conversation without a second glance at me. Daniel smiled. He leaned back in his chair, the corners of his mouth curling upward, savoring the humiliation as though it were dessert. I wanted to scream to tell them that not everyone wanted to be a lawyer or a banker, that not everyone measured worth in money or titles. But my words dissolved before they ever reached my tongue. At that table, Daniel's voice always roared like a trumpet, while mine flickered like a candle in the wind. I sat there with my fork untouched, the chicken cooling on my plate. My chest tightened until it hurt. The laughter returned now about Daniel's latest project, his brilliance, his bright future. I was once again erased, replaced by his glow. Later that night, I crept up the staircase, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. I was halfway to my room when I froze. From below, I heard my mother's whisper, "She only brings us shame." I gripped the banister, my knuckles turning white. The wood dug into my palm until I felt the sting, the skin breaking, just slightly, blood dotting my hand. I stood there for a long time, unable to move, letting those words carve themselves into me like a scar that would never heal. Upstairs in my room, I sat by the window, staring out at the maple trees swaying in the night wind. My chest felt hollow, but somewhere deep inside, a quiet defiance began to stir. That was the night I swore to myself that I would leave that house. I would walk away from their approval, from their endless comparisons, from the prison of their expectations. But the scars of that vow never faded. Even after I moved out, even after I built a life of my own, modest, yes but honest, the voice of that night followed me. My mother's whisper, my father's indifference, Daniel's smirk. They lived in my bones, waiting, always waiting for the next moment to rise and remind me who I was to them, the failed daughter. And tonight, in that ballroom filled with laughter and glitter, they rose again. The insult from Daniel, the chuckles from our relatives, The pity in strangers' eyes, it was the same script replayed on a grander stage. My past had never really left me. It had only been waiting for its cue. As I sat there at the wedding table, my back straight, my pearls cool against my skin, I thought of that staircase in Connecticut. I thought of the blood on my hand, the vow I made under my breath, the silent promise that one day I would not be the shame of anyone. The pain was still sharp. It throbbed like a wound reopened, but there was also something else now, something stronger than the hurt. Tonight, humiliation no longer made me crumble. It ignited me. I knew that the scars would never disappear, that the voices of my childhood would always whisper in moments like this. But I also knew that I was not the same girl who sat at the dinner table waiting for someone to see her. Tonight, for the first time, I felt the shift inside me. Their cruelty had built the cage, but it had also given me the strength to break free. And as Daniel raised his glass again, his smile wide and hollow under the golden light, I realized something with a clarity I had never felt before. The past might have named me a failure, but the future was still mine to claim. The ballroom pulsed with laughter and music, a sea of sequins and champagne glasses catching the light. But I sat at the far end of the family table, clutching a glass of water that had long since lost its chill. I let the rim rest against my lips, without drinking, my fingers gripping so tightly that I could feel the condensation soak into my skin. The chatter around me faded into a dull hum, for in my mind only one face remained vivid. Mark Ellison. The thought of him steadied me like a hand on my shoulder. While I sat among people who viewed me as little more than an object of ridicule, remembering him reminded me I was not as alone as they wanted me to feel. It had been the summer of 2021 when our paths crossed. I had driven up to Vermont for a community nutrition project, my car packed with boxes of pamphlets and food charts. My heart full of hope, even as my bank account dwindled. The families there lived in trailers that sagged against the wind, children with hollow cheeks lining up for the small cartons of milk we brought. That was my world, the kind of work nobody in my family thought worthy of notice. He appeared quietly, without announcement, standing near the church hall where the program was being held. A tall man, hair a little untidy, his shirt wrinkled as though he had worn it through a long day, and sneakers that had clearly walked more miles than most men in his position ever would. I thought he was a local volunteer, someone who had wandered in with curiosity. His smile was soft, his voice unhurried when he asked if I needed help unloading the boxes. I said yes. He carried them with ease, his movements simple and natural, no arrogance, no show. Later I learned he had been funding the entire project, writing checks so large they kept our programs alive for years. He never mentioned it himself. Someone else let it slip. He was the CEO of a tech company in San Francisco, one valued in the billions, his name whispered in boardrooms and business magazines. I could hardly believe it. For weeks after I waited for the moment when his mask would drop, when the polished executive would reveal himself and treat me the way my own family always had, with judgment, with measurement, with cold disdain for anything that didn't gleam with status. But he never did. He kept showing up, sitting cross-legged on the floor with children tasting the meals I prepared, asking about the nutrition charts, as if my words mattered. I wrestled with confusion and fear. Why would a man like him look twice at me, a community health counselor scraping by in a small apartment carrying the label of failure that my parents and Daniel had stitched onto me for years? There were moments I almost told my parents about him. I would imagine their faces, the way their brows would rise, their voices dripping with sudden approval, not for me but for the wealth attached to him. They would transform my love into currency, a bargaining chip to elevate the family's standing. That thought made me sick. So I kept him hidden, my secret, my quiet rebellion against the world they forced on me. One night stands out in my memory as sharply as if it were yesterday. He had come to my apartment after a long day. The place was small, only 2 rooms and a kitchen where the cabinets creaked when you opened them. He sat on the old wooden chair that wobbled slightly under his weight, looking around at the mismatched furniture, the chipped paint, the books stacked in corners because I had no shelves. He smiled. His eyes softened as he said, "I like it here. It feels real. It feels like you." Something broke inside me then. I sat down beside him and cried, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen. Not measured against a standard, not reduced to a disappointment, but recognized simply as myself. No man had ever given me that before. At that moment, I knew he was not a man I needed to parade before my family as proof of worth. He was the man I wanted to shield from their hunger for status, their endless games of pride and comparison. He was mine in a way they could never comprehend. So I kept him apart from this world, never inviting him to family dinners, never mentioning his name when my mother asked why I was still single, never allowing Daniel to have ammunition to twist into another insult. And now, sitting in that glittering hall, the air filled with laughter at my expense, I held his memory close like armor. The jeers and whispers around me slid off, because beneath my silence lived the knowledge of who I really belonged to. No one at that table, no one in that hall knew that I was already promised, that the man who had chosen me was not just powerful in the ways my family worshipped, but powerful in the ways they could never touch in kindness, in integrity, in his refusal to see me as less. The secret stayed inside me, pulsing, steady, almost sweet. I looked around at their painted faces, their smug laughter, and I thought to myself, let them laugh. Their time will come. For now I sat still, smiling faintly at nothing, my hand brushing the cool pearls at my throat. The secret I carried was not a burden but a promise. And when the moment arrived, when he finally stepped into their world, their laughter would stop cold. The humiliation they threw at me tonight would pale against the silence that would fall when the truth unfolded. And in that silence, I would no longer be the failed daughter. I would be exactly what I always knew. I was worthy, loved, and unbreakable. The music in the ballroom swelled with brass and strings, the rhythm of the jazz band weaving through laughter and clinking glasses. Golden light spilled across the tables, catching in the cut of crystal goblets and the polished silverware. Everywhere I turned, I saw extravagance. Imported roses spilling from tall glass vases, champagne bottles lined like trophies, waiters gliding through the aisles in pressed uniforms. It was dazzling, overwhelming, and to my eyes, entirely hollow. I sat near the corner of our family table, my chair angled just enough that I could observe without being drawn into the loud conversations. The wedding sparkled like a magazine spread, but the more I looked, the more false it seemed. Luxury, yes, but not the kind born of wealth that had roots. This felt like something borrowed, a mask stretched too tightly across a face. Evelyn leaned toward me, her perfume faint against the sharp scent of roses. She had been my friend since high school, one of the few people who had ever looked past my family's shadow. Her voice dropped low enough for only me to hear. Clara, did you know? Daniel borrowed more than $200,000 just to pay for all of this. The bank has his file waiting. Her words cut through me like ice. I turned slowly, watching my brother across the room. He stood arm in arm with Rachel, his new bride grinning as if he owned not just this hall but the entire city. His laughter was sharp, his tuxedo perfect, his glass lifted high as he greeted guest after guest. On the surface, he was the golden sun once again. But beneath it lay debt heavy and suffocating. My chest tightened with a mix of anger and bitter recognition. I could still hear his voice from countless arguments, the way he threw words like stones. Your poor Clara. No future, no one will ever want you. And yet here he was, shackled to a mountain of loans, just to build a stage for admiration. He had constructed a palace of lies on credit, hoping no one would notice the cracks beneath the marble. For years I had lived simply. My apartment was small, my furniture worn, but it was mine. My work never made me rich, but it was honest. He had mocked me for it, called me a failure. Now I looked at him basking in applause he had bought on borrowed money, and I wondered which of us truly lived in shame. Rachel's hand clung to his arm as he poured champagne into the glasses of their guests. I studied her face as the bubbles fizzed, her smile stretched wide, her posture poised. But her eyes betrayed her. Just for a second, I caught the flicker of worry in them, the way her gaze darted toward him, searching, questioning. Her fingers squeezed his hand too tightly, and then almost instantly, she smoothed her expression back into perfection. She knew. Of course she knew. She understood the fragility of the foundation beneath her wedding gown and the towering cake behind her. But she chose silence. Because for Rachel, like for so many who had stepped into my family's orbit, the glow of Daniel's charm, the promise of his status, mattered more than truth, a hollow partnership dressed in lace and champagne. I touched the pearls at my throat, their coolness steadying me. They were all I had left from my grandmother, a woman who had taught me that dignity mattered more than display. Her words came back to me as I watched Daniel, laughing his arm, raise the crowd adoring him. Applause fades. The character does not. The bitterness in me mixed with pity. He had worked so hard to make me small, to make me believe I was worthless. Yet here he was, the so-called success, standing on a stage propped up by creditors. His kingdom of roses and crystal was no more solid than smoke. I looked around the hall at the glittering gowns and the endless trays of hors d'oeuvres, at the champagne flowing like water. All of it was a performance, and everyone was too eager to believe it, too eager to bow to a show. But I knew. I saw the truth behind the gold. And I understood that when the storm came, when the banks called in their loans and the mask slipped from Daniel's face, this night of grandeur would turn into his deepest humiliation. And every insult he had flung at me, every sneer and laugh would turn back on him sharper than a blade. I sat back in my chair, fingers resting lightly on the pearls, the noise of the party swirling around me. For a moment I closed my eyes and let the sound blur into nothing. I could almost see it, the day when all of this would collapse, when his pride would crumble under the weight of his own lies. And in that vision, I no longer felt like the failed daughter. I felt like the only one who had chosen truth over spectacle, dignity over shame. When I opened my eyes, Daniel was lifting his glass again, Rachel smiling at his side, guests roaring with approval. The music swelled, laughter filled the air, but to me it sounded fragile, like glass ready to shatter with the smallest strike. The night glittered on, but I knew the truth. One gust of reality and the palace of his pride would collapse. And when it did, I would be there to see it. By the time the evening reached its middle, the air inside the ballroom was heavy with wine and laughter. Glasses of deep red Merlot caught the glow of chandeliers, the chime of cutlery against porcelain blended with chatter. I sat at a round table tucked to the side, surrounded by distant relatives, people whose names I could barely recall, but whose eyes now sparkled with judgment disguised as interest. Their smiles were polite, but behind them I felt the sharpness waiting. One of my aunts leaned toward me, her perfume thick and floral, her voice pitched sweet but edged with mockery. "Clara, are you wearing the same dress from last year? I could swear I saw you in it at Christmas." Her eyes lingered on the neckline of my simple black gown, her lips curving in satisfaction. Before I could form a reply, an uncle chuckled and chimed in. "Maybe she's saving money. But saving for what? It's not like she has a wedding to plan." The table erupted in a ripple of laughter soft enough to pass as harmless, but each chuckle stabbed into me. I felt my jaw tighten as I forced a small smile. My fingers traced the rim of my water glass, the cool condensation sliding onto my skin. I wanted to shrink into the chair, to disappear into the music. But the spotlight at this table wasn't on the bride and groom anymore. It was on me. Evelyn, sitting beside me, leaned in with a steadiness that reminded me why she had always been my anchor. "Clara works in community health," she said firmly. "She helps people every day." Her tone was calm, almost maternal, but before the warmth of her defense could settle, another voice cut across it. It was my mother. Susan, her face composed in that practiced way she always had in public, spoke without hesitation. "Work is work, sure, but it doesn't earn much, does it? Anyone can do odd jobs like that." She didn't even look at me as she spoke, her eyes locked on the tablecloth as if I were invisible. The laughter quieted into something heavier, an air thick with unspoken agreement. My breath caught in my chest. It felt like the table had transformed into a courtroom, and I was standing trial without a chance to defend myself. My family once again was the judge, the jury, and I was disappointed. I clenched my hands in my lap nails, pressing into my palms. Words fought at the back of my throat. I wanted to tell them my work mattered, that every child I helped, every family I guided was proof that my life had value. But the moment had already slipped, drowned beneath the smirks and raised eyebrows circling the table. Then a man I didn't even know well, a friend of Daniel's, leaned his chair back, his voice pitched just enough to carry. "So the groom's sister is still single. Really, at her age? I guess she must be impossibly picky." His grin widened, and the laughter this time rolled louder, freer. Not just from family, but from strangers who found amusement in my humiliation. It wasn't laughter shared. It was laughter aimed. The sound hit me harder than I expected. It was one thing to endure my brother's jabs, my parents' dismissals, but this being mocked openly by people who had no stake in my life felt like standing naked in the middle of the room while everyone pointed. I straightened in my chair, spine rigid as though posture could be armor. My eyes burned, but I blinked hard, refusing to let a single tear fall. If I cried, they would win. They would see weakness, confirmation of every cruel assumption they made. Evelyn's hand brushed mine under the table, a silent reminder that I wasn't completely alone. But even her presence couldn't drown out the heat in my face, the pounding in my chest, the way my ears filled with the echoes of their laughter. The voices at the table swirled into background noise fragments floating to me through the haze. Poor Clara. What a shame. She'll end up alone. Each phrase tangled with memories of my childhood dinners, of the moments when silence was my only shield. But tonight was not silent. Tonight was ridiculous, dressed in smiles and wine glasses. I held myself still, my breathing shallow, my gaze steady on the centerpiece of roses in front of me. Their petals were perfect, unmarred, as if untouched by the world. I wished I could be like that for a moment, untouched. The laughter faded into chatter again, and the conversation shifted back to Rachel's gown, Daniel's charm, the splendor of the night. The table forgot me just as quickly as it had targeted me, but I couldn't forget. The sting remained, carved deeper by the fact that it wasn't just family tearing me apart anymore. It was the community around them, strangers, who found it acceptable to join in the cruelty. Inside, a storm gathered. I felt the weight of years pressing on me, years of being dismissed, belittled, mocked. Tonight the storm grew darker, stronger, fed by every smirk and sneer. I kept my face calm, my back straight, my hands folded. Outwardly, I was composed. But within me, thunder rolled, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me, this was only the beginning. The night had not yet reached its cruelest turn. The worst was still to come. I slipped away from the crowded ballroom, the weight of laughter and whispers still pressing on my chest. The corridor stretched long and hushed, lined with mirrors framed in gold, their reflections catching the glow of soft amber lights. Each step echoed faintly beneath my heels, a rhythm that steadied my breath. When I reached the bridal suite and gently pushed the door open, the sight before me gave me pause. Rachel sat alone at the vanity, the ivory folds of her gown spilling around her like a pool of silk. Her makeup was flawless, lips painted in a soft rose, lashes long and dark. But her eyes betrayed her, rimmed with weariness, as if even on her wedding day, happiness was something she had to pretend to wear. She turned at the sound of the door and forced a smile. "Clara, thank you for coming," she said softly. Her tone surprised me. It was the first private moment we had shared all day, and I hesitated, unsure of what she wanted. Schwad. I began to murmur a polite congratulations, but she cut across my words, her voice steadier than her fragile expression. Daniel decided everything. The flowers, the music, even this dress. I just nodded along. In the mirror, I saw her lips curve into a thin smile, but her eyes glistened with something else, resentment, resignation, perhaps both. I walked closer, the faint scent of lilies and perfume mixing in the air. Rachel's hands rested on her lap, fingers laced tightly as if she needed to hold herself together. For a moment, silence stretched between us, filled only by the muffled hum of music leaking from the ballroom beyond the walls. Then she turned her gaze, locking onto mine, and her voice dropped into something more intimate. "I used to admire you, Clara. You left home. You carved out your own life. I never had the courage." Her confession caught me off guard, stirring something inside me. I wanted to reach out to tell her that courage was not the absence of fear but the choice to live despite it. Yet before I could speak, she pressed on her words, gaining a sharper edge. At least you still have your freedom. I don't. I am tied to this marriage. But... Her lips curled into a faint, almost mocking smile. Nobody wants to marry someone like you, do they? You are independent, yes, but independence is only respected if others see value in it. The words landed hard, cold as steel against my ribs. My breath caught, and I studied her face, searching for truth beneath the bitterness. Rachel was not happy that much was clear. She was a woman trapped, her future dictated by my brother's ambition, her choices stripped away. And yet rather than turning her anger toward Daniel, she had aimed her blade at me. Her envy dressed itself as cruelty, as though my existence reminded her of everything she could not claim. Her laughter, quiet and hollow, slipped into the space between us. I realized then how easily pain could twist into malice, how women cornered by expectations sometimes lashed out at each other instead of the men who built the cages. I held her gaze but said nothing. Words would change nothing in this room. Her bitterness was hers to carry, just as my scars were mine. When I finally turned to leave, the soft rustle of my dress filled the silence. Behind me, I heard it. Rachel's laugh again, low and brittle, the kind of laugh that sounded more like a crack in porcelain than joy. I stepped back into the hallway, the door closing quietly behind me. Her laughter lingered, clinging to me like perfume, sharp and sour. It was not the laugh of a woman in love or in triumph. It was the sound of someone who had lost herself and wanted desperately for someone else to feel as small. And in that moment I knew that Rachel's marriage would not be her salvation. It would be her undoing. And somehow I also knew that her downfall would weave itself into the larger reckoning that was still waiting for us all. The door to the bridal suite closed behind me, and for a moment the muffled music of the ballroom wrapped around me like a tide. I had barely taken a step down the corridor when I heard my name sharp and clipped. Clara. I turned to see my mother Susan standing rigid in the hallway. My father Robert was beside her, his expression carved in stone. Without another word, they guided me down a narrow passage that led to the service wing of the hotel. The air was cooler here. The golden chandeliers replaced by dim wall sconces that cast long shadows. We stopped in a stretch of quiet, far from the laughter and clinking glasses of the wedding guests. For the first time that day, it was just the three of us. Susan crossed her arms, her pearls glinting in the light. Her eyes narrowed sharp as the edge of glass. Clara, she said, her tone heavy with command. Do not embarrass us any further. All you need to do is sit down, smile politely, and let people know you are happy for your brother. This is Daniel's day, not yours. I felt the words hit me like stones, each one pressing down on the air in my lungs. Robert gave a slow nod, his voice a low rumble. This wedding is more than a celebration. It is a door opening to the right people, the right circles. Daniel has finally placed this family where it belongs. And you, his voice trailed, but the weight of his gaze finished the sentence. His silence was more cutting than any insult. A familiar tightness spread across my chest, the same suffocating grip I had felt countless times growing up at that dinner table in Connecticut. Every memory came back, the small slights, the dismissive laughs, the endless comparisons. My hands trembled, but I steadied them by clasping them in front of me. I spoke, my voice unsteady but clear. I have stayed silent my whole life just to please you. I have swallowed your words, ignored your looks, and let you pretend Daniel was the only child that mattered. But just because I chose a different path does not give you the right to treat me like a failure. Susan's lips curled into a cold smile, and she let out a dry laugh that scraped against my nerves. You call this a life, a menial job with a paycheck that barely pays your rent. Alone in your 30s with no one to care for you when you are old. Do you think anyone will admire you then? You will die in that apartment of yours, Clara, and no one will even notice. Her words cut deeper than I expected, slicing into the tender places I tried to protect. But this time I did not lower my head. I lifted my chin and looked directly into her eyes, steadying my breath. I would rather live alone with my own respect, I said slowly, than pretend to be happy inside a hollow shell. just like what you have taught Daniel to build." The hallway went still. Robert shifted beside her, his brow furrowed for the first time. For a fleeting moment there was something in his eyes, doubt perhaps, but it vanished quickly. Susan's face flushed crimson, her mouth opening as if to strike back, but no words came. I turned then, the echo of my heels sharp against the floor as I walked away. Behind me they stood rooted in the dim corridor, swallowed by silence. For the first time in years I felt the heavy chain of silence between us shatter. My voice, long buried under their contempt, had finally broken through. Yet even as I stepped closer to the ballroom, I knew this was not victory. The war between us was far from finished. Beyond those doors lay a sea of guests, all watching, all eager for a spectacle. And Daniel would not let the night end without turning me into his target once again. I walked back into the ballroom, the laughter and music crashing into me like a wave. The chandeliers blazed above, their golden light falling across the pristine white tablecloths. Glasses of wine clinked together, guests raised their voices in cheer, and a band played something light and celebratory from the stage. I slid into my seat, spine straight, face carefully composed. Yet inside, my mother's words still reverberated, jagged and sharp, like broken glass lodged beneath my skin. Daniel stood at the center of it all, a microphone in hand, his tuxedo gleaming, his smile practiced and charming. To the crowd he looked every bit the golden boy, the perfect son, the successful groom. But when his eyes flickered toward me, I saw it, that glint of malice. He raised his glass, his voice projecting across the entire hall. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate with us. Today marks the start of a new chapter, one filled with happiness and success, with my beautiful wife Rachel by my side." The applause was polite, scattered. He waited, then leaned into the moment, his smile widening, his words slicing clean through the air. "And hopefully one day my sister Clara will also find someone willing to marry her." Laughter erupted like a wildfire, rolling in waves across the tables. Some guests turned their heads toward me, eyes gleaming with pity, others with amusement, as if my humiliation was entertainment. My face burned. Every beat of my heart thudded against my ribs, a drum that grew louder, faster as the laughter rippled. Beneath the table, Evelyn's hand found mine, her fingers squeezing tight. "Don't let him pull you down," she whispered, her voice like a thread of sanity in the chaos. But I could not sit quietly anymore. The heat in my chest spread until it felt like fire coursing through my veins. I had endured enough, the snide comments from relatives, the cold dismissal of my parents, the hidden barbs from Rachel. And now Daniel, my own brother, was using me as a punchline, feeding my dignity to the crowd. I pushed my chair back. The sound echoed louder than I expected, cutting into the laughter. Heads turned, voices fell silent. The music stopped. I rose, my hands steady, my chin lifted. Every eye in the room fixed on me. I looked directly at Daniel, my voice clear, even sharp as glass. "Thank you, Daniel, for your concern about my private life. But you should remember something. Marriage does not always equal happiness. I would rather live alone with self-respect than pretend to be happy inside a hollow shell." The silence that followed was absolute. For a few long seconds, no one moved. A woman at the far table pressed her lips together, nodding ever so slightly. Another guest looked down into his wine glass, suddenly fascinated by the swirl of liquid. Daniel's grin froze on his face, rigid and unnatural, before he forced out a strained laugh. "Come on, Clara," he said, his voice too high, too brittle. "Just a joke." But the joke had cracked open something larger, something he could not control. The air was different now, charged, the guests no longer laughing but watching, measuring, weighing. For the first time that evening, Daniel was not the one in command of the room. I lowered myself back into my chair, my heart hammering against my ribs. My palms were damp, but my face remained steady, my back straight. I had broken the script they had written for me, the quiet, compliant Clara, who absorbed every insult without protest. I could feel the shift, subtle but undeniable. This was no longer just about me being the family's shame. Tonight, in this glittering hall filled with laughter and lies, a new battle line had been drawn. And deep inside, I knew that what had just happened was only a spark. The true reversal, The moment that would silence them all had not yet arrived. It was coming, and when it did, no one in this room would ever laugh at me again. The ballroom still carried the sting of my words. Daniel's forced laughter echoed thinly brittle as glass about to splinter, as he raised his champagne flute and begged the guests to drink. But the room did not recover. No amount of charm could patch the crack that had already spread. The air was heavy strained, as if even the chandeliers above had dimmed with unease. I sat tall palms pressed lightly to the tablecloth, every curious gaze brushing against me like invisible fingers. Then the double doors at the far end swung open with a weighty thud. A man in a charcoal suit entered his stride, measured, unhurried, his shoulders squared with quiet authority. He carried no glass, no smile, no hint of celebration. The click of his polished shoes echoed across the marble each step, pulling silence deeper into the room. Whispers stirred at once. "Who is that? Did someone invite him?" Guests craned their necks. Brows furrowed, their laughter faltering into uneasy murmurs. Rachel's grip on Daniel's arm tightened until her knuckles whitened. Evelyn beside me sat straighter, her breath caught as though she sensed the storm just beyond the horizon. I knew him instantly. James Carter, Mark's manager, loyal for more than a decade. His presence alone was enough to unsettle me, for if James was here, then the walls of secrecy I had built were about to fall. James crossed the ballroom without pause, ignoring the curious stares and frantic whispers. He stopped at my table, bowed his head with restrained courtesy, and spoke clearly enough for the entire hall to hear. "Ma'am, your boss just landed and is waiting outside his private jet." The words dropped like a stone into a still pond. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint clatter of a fork slipping from someone's hand. Even the band, caught mid-song, faltered into stillness. Every face turned toward me. Shock rippled through the crowd. Some gasped audibly, others whispered behind raised hands. Brows arched, lips parted. I saw one man, a business associate of my father's, frown deeply, his eyes narrowing as though he had just recognized the name hidden in that single phrase. Then Daniel's laughter cut through the tension, too sharp, too desperate. "Boss, you... What are you even talking about? A boss with a private jet? Clara, please. Don't tell me you're playing secretary for some sugar daddy." A few chuckles followed, but they lacked the confidence of before. This time the laughter was thin, hesitant, tainted with doubt. I felt it shift, the unease threading through the room like an undercurrent. James didn't flinch. His spine remained straight, his gaze steady. When he spoke again, his words were crisp, deliberate, each syllable landing with the weight of truth. "Mr. Ellison arranged a special flight from San Francisco just to be here today. He asks that you join him outside as soon as it is convenient." The name hung in the air. Ellison. Whispers erupted at once, hushed but frantic. I saw recognition flare across several faces. One woman gasped, hand flying to her mouth, while her husband muttered, "Isn't that the Ellison from Forbes?" Another guest leaned toward his companion, whispering so urgently the veins in his neck strained. Even those who had not yet placed the name reacted instinctively, their postures shifting, their laughter dying completely. At the far table, my mother's face was drained of all color. Susan clutched at Robert's arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as if to anchor herself from collapsing. My father's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing, dark suspicion and dread flickering across them. Beside me, Evelyn leaned close, her voice a whisper edged with awe. "Is he here?" But it was Daniel's face that betrayed the deepest crack. The confident grin was gone, replaced by a rigid mask, his jaw twitching. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting between James and me, his hand tightening around the stem of his champagne glass until the crystal trembled with the strain. My chest rose slowly, my breath steadying. For years I had been the one shrinking under the weight of judgment, their scorn cutting me into silence. And now, with a single sentence, James had shifted the balance. I lifted my chin. A slow smile touched my lips, not gloating, not cruel, but certain. I did not need to answer Daniel's ridicule. My silence was louder now than any words I could speak. The guests leaned forward in their chairs, hungry for the next revelation. Some exchanged quick knowing glances, others studied me with a mix of awe and disbelief. Daniel shifted visibly uncomfortable under their scrutiny. My parents looked stricken as though the marble floor beneath them might give way. Inside relief swelled in me, tangled with anticipation. Every humiliation I had endured, every sneer and whisper was unraveling thread by thread. And yet, I knew this was not the final reckoning. This was only the prelude, the whisper before the thunder. Beyond those doors, the truth was waiting, and when it stepped inside, no one in this hall would ever look at me the same way again. The murmurs had barely died down after James's announcement when the doors opened again. This time, even the air seemed to pause. Every whisper was cut short, every glass stilled in midair. And then Mark walked in. The tailored navy suit fit him with the kind of precision money could buy, yet nothing about him was ostentatious. His stride was deliberate, measured each step resonating on the marble floor like a drumbeat. Light glanced off the silver of his watch, but it was his composure, quiet, unshakable, that commanded the room. He didn't look at anyone else. His eyes found mine instantly, and with each step closer, my chest tightened. My heart pounded not with fear, but with the raw, overwhelming knowledge that the secret I had carried for so long was no longer mine to guard. When he reached me, there was no hesitation. His hand enveloped mine, firm yet gentle, and he bowed, pressing his lips against my fingers. An old-fashioned gesture, tender yet thunderous in its impact. The silence shattered as his voice spread through the hall, low, steady, final. "She's my fiancé." The ballroom erupted. Gasps shot through the air, a ripple of disbelief rolling from table to table. A woman at the back clapped her hand to her mouth, eyes wide. Another guest fumbled with his glass red wine spilling across the linen. Conversations broke into frantic whispers. Ellison. Did he say Ellison? Each name, each echo carrying both awe and recognition. For a moment, I simply stood there, my hand in his, feeling the weight of years of humiliation fall away like dust. Yet the disbelief still pressed in around me, sharp and suffocating. I glanced at the faces I had known all my life. My mother's skin had gone paper white, her hand clutching at my father's sleeve. Robert stared hard, his lips tight as though forcing himself to deny what stood before him. Daniel was different. He stood rigid, his tuxedo suddenly too tight, red wine sloshing violently in his trembling hand before spilling down his cuff. His face burned crimson with rage, humiliation, or both. His laugh broke the air, brittle cracking halfway through. "No, this is ridiculous. You're staging this. Clara, what is this? Some stunt to steal my wedding." He looked to the crowd for support but found none. Guests shifted uneasily, some avoiding his gaze, others staring at him with thinly veiled contempt. Mark turned to him, his expression calm, his gaze cutting sharp as steel. "No, Daniel, I am not here to steal your moment. I am here because this is the woman I love, and I will not stand by while she is humiliated." The silence that followed was suffocating. Forks stilled midway to mouths. A cough broke awkward and then died. Every guest, every relative, every so-called friend leaned in, their attention fixed. Mark's hand tightened around mine, anchoring me. His voice rose again, firm, deliberate, filling every corner of the ballroom. "She has endured disdain long enough. But not anymore. From this day forward, no one speaks of Clara as if she is less. She is not only my fiancée, she is the strongest woman I have ever known." The effect was instant. A ripple moved across the guests. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed. Others whispered furiously, piecing together every mocking laugh, every cruel comment they had shared at my expense only hours before. One woman discreetly raised her phone recording as though determined to capture the collapse of Daniel's carefully crafted world. I felt it, the shift. The people who once smirked now looked at me with something closer to respect. Some even with admiration. Their eyes no longer mocked. They measured, judged, reevaluated. Daniel's lips parted, but no sound came. He stood in the wreckage of his own pride, his gaze darting from Mark to me to the crowd that was no longer his. For the first time in years, I breathed freely. I was no longer the shadow, no longer the disappointment. I was seen, unashamed, whole. The storm had broken, and Daniel, not I, was left drowning in its wreckage. The silence that followed Mark's words was heavier than anything I had ever felt. The chandeliers still glistened, the roses still perfumed the air, but no one cared anymore. Every pair of eyes in the hall turned toward my family's table, the very place from which the sharpest barbs had been thrown at me only hours before. My mother moved first. Susan stood, her face stiff, her hands fumbling as she tried to summon grace. A smile stretched across her lips, brittle and trembling. "Mark," she said, her voice thin but audible, "so good to finally meet you. Clara has always been special. We've always been proud of her." Her hand came down on my shoulder, but it shook, and the weight of it was not warmth, but desperation. Around us, I heard a few stifled chuckles. Others tilted their heads, smirking at the performance. My father followed, his baritone voice betraying a strain he rarely showed in public. "This is certainly unexpected. Clara, you should have told us sooner. You know your mother and we've always believed in you." The words hung hollow in the air. Guests shifted in their seats. Some raised eyebrows, others exchanged knowing glances. A young man at the far table even muttered, "Always believed." That's not what I heard earlier, drawing a ripple of hushed laughter. Their faces revealed what my parents refused to admit. Everyone could see the scramble, the desperate attempt to rewrite the years of disdain. Daniel, however, stood frozen. The groom, the centerpiece of the day, had lost his color. His hand clenched so tightly around his glass that the stem threatened to snap. Red wine spilled over his knuckles, dripping onto the pristine linen like bloodstains on snow. His chest heaved, and at last he burst out, "This is a trick, a spectacle. You made this up, Clara. You're trying to ruin my wedding." His voice cracked, rising higher than he intended, betraying the panic that gripped him. Mark turned his head toward him, his calmness a contrast so sharp it cut like ice. His eyes locked on Daniel's, unblinking, steady. "No, Daniel. I didn't come here to ruin anything. I came to take the woman I love away from a room filled with ridicule. If your wedding feels ruined because of that, perhaps it isn't Clara who's to blame. Perhaps it's the way you've chosen to treat your own sister." The words struck like a gavel. Murmurs erupted across the hall. A woman shook her head, whispering to her husband. Another leaned back with a half smile, as though savoring the collapse. A guest near the back lifted his phone, discreetly recording, capturing every twitch of Daniel's jaw, every collapse of my parents' false smiles. What began as a wedding was becoming a public record of disgrace. And then Rachel. Sitting stiffly beside Daniel in her flawless white gown, her spine rigid, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that the lace gloves puckered. She kept her eyes trained on the table, but I caught the flickered, darting glances, scanning faces, searching desperately for sympathy. What she found instead were smirks, pity, even mockery, her lips pressed into a thin line, her cheeks blotched faint pink beneath the flawless makeup. The bride, who should have basked in admiration, now sat like a figure carved from porcelain, cracking under the weight of the room's pity. "Evelyn, faithful," Evelyn leaned toward me, her voice a whisper only I could hear. "They deserve this. Every second of it." I met her eyes and gave a small nod. No triumph, no gloating, just calm acceptance. For the first time in years, I no longer needed to fight for words. The truth was speaking for me. Daniel lowered his head, shoulders, hunched, arrogance stripped away. He no longer tried to defend himself. My parents' smiles, once brittle, now collapsed entirely into blank, rigid masks. Rachel sat frozen, her beauty gown transformed into a costume of shame. The audience had already judged them. I sat back in my chair, spine straight, chin lifted. I did not need to sneer or remind them of every insult. The silence that pressed in around them was punishment enough. The weight of hundreds of eyes, the humiliation of being exposed, was sharper than any words I could wield. For years I had been the one, diminished, erased, dismissed. And now, under the same chandeliers that had once illuminated my shame, I watched them bow beneath the burden of their own. The tables had turned, and for the first time I no longer felt like the failure they had painted me to be. After Mark's words rang through the hall, The air turned unbearably heavy. The laughter that had once stung my ears was gone, replaced by whispers that hovered like smoke above the tables. Guests shifted in their seats, no longer entertained, but unsettled. My family sat collapsed into themselves, pale and rigid, as though every ounce of pride had been drained away. Daniel, who only hours before had basked in admiration, now looked like a man whose crown had been stolen in full view of the world. Mark's hand closed around mine. His voice was steady low enough for only me to hear. "We do not need to stay here another second." I nodded, feeling the truth of it sink into me. Slowly, deliberately, I rose to my feet. The chair legs scraped against the thick carpet, the sound cutting through the silence of the room. Every head turned. The eyes that once mocked me now followed me with something else entirely. Curiosity, awe, even unease. Evelyn, seated beside me, met my gaze and gave a subtle nod, her lips curving into a smile of quiet triumph. I had taken only a few steps when I heard my mother's voice. Susan stood abruptly, her chair nearly toppling behind her. Her face was blotched with color, her lips trembling. "Clara, don't go. We are still a family. You cannot just walk away from us." I turned back and met her eyes. For once there was no fear in my chest. My words came out clear, steady, carrying into the hushed corners of the room. A family should lift one another, not tear each other down to feel superior. You chose pride over truth, and tonight the truth has demanded its due. The look on her face was not a surprise but recognition. She knew it was true, and that knowledge left her speechless. I straightened. Let her silence linger, then turned toward the exit again. Mark's grip on my hand tightened as we walked together through the aisle of tables. People whispered as we passed. Some nodded with respect, others exchanged glances filled with regret, and a few even clapped softly as if acknowledging the moment for what it was. I caught sight of two younger guests raising their phones, recording as if to preserve the downfall of the Golden family. A woman leaned toward her companion and muttered, "They'll never recover from this." Daniel kept his head bowed, his glass shattered on the table beside him. Rachel's smile was frozen, her hand gripping the edge of the tablecloth until her knuckles whitened. She looked every bit the perfect bride still, but the tremor in her fingers betrayed her. The great doors opened and light poured in from outside. It was harsh, brilliant, cutting through the dim gold glow of the ballroom. It felt like freedom. I stepped through without hesitation, my heels tapping against the marble floor, each step carrying me further from the years of humiliation I had endured. Behind me, the murmurs grew, an endless tide of whispers, judgment, speculation. Even as the doors closed, I knew the sound would follow my family long after tonight. When Mark's car pulled away from the hotel, I sank into the soft leather seat, watching the lights of Boston flicker past the window. The night air beyond the glass felt alive, almost celebratory, as though the city itself had witnessed my release. My chest loosened, and for the first time in a long time I could breathe without the weight of shame pressing down on me. I was no longer the failure, the forgotten daughter the sister held up for ridicule. I was the woman who had survived it all and walked out standing tall. My voice broke the silence, calm and steady, as though speaking not only to myself but to everyone who had ever known the sting of mockery. Family can laugh at you, dismiss you, strip you of dignity, but if you hold on to your worth, justice finds its way. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is not in making them suffer, but in living better than they ever believed you could. And now I ask you, have you ever been belittled by family or those closest to you, only to one day watch them fall silent before your strength? Share your story in the comments. And if you want to hear more tales of justice, family, and sweet revenge, remember to like and subscribe. The next